Good afternoon and welcome to our conversation with Lucy Cooke. We're very excited and we thank you so much for braving what sounds like a lot of transportation issues and this lovely weather that has been with us for days now. I want to begin by thanking our co-hosts. They're all up here because there's so many, and I hope to get everybody in my thanks, but they're also listed up here. And I think there's something to say about how many people and how many parts of this university are so excited about this event and about being involved with it. So our co-hosts are the graduate programs in sustainability management, sustainability science, science journalism, and Columbia Journalism School's Women in Media group. And our event sponsors are the narrative medicine, bioethics, negotiation and conflict resolution programs, as well as the MPA in environmental science and policy and E3B. So thanks to everybody. And now I'm delighted to introduce Lucy Cooke, a British zoologist, filmmaker, and author who has gained widespread recognition for her work in wildlife conservation and storytelling. Lucy has a background in zoology from New College, Oxford, and has dedicated her career to exploring and promoting the wonders of the animal kingdom. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, NPR, the BBC, National Geographic, among many, many other places. Her books have topped multiple bestseller lists. The Truth About Animals delves into the curious behaviors of various species, from the misunderstood sloth to the mysterious beaver, debunking with current scientific research the ill-conceived notions of animals that were developed by Aristotle and Descartes. In her most recent book, Bitch, on the Female of the Species, one of the best titles and covers ever, she takes on myths surrounding the females of the non-human world. As her publisher writes, since Charles Darwin, evolutionary biologists have been convinced that the males of the animal kingdom are the interesting ones, dominating and promiscuous, while females are dull, passive, and devoted. In Bitch, she takes on myths, in Bitch, Cooke shares with us different, richer evolutionary biology, one in which females are as varied, powerful, and fascinating. Joining Lucy for this conversation is Louise Rosen, Senior Associate Dean of Administration and Communications at the School of Professional Studies, lecturer in environmental policy at the School of International Public Affairs, and an alum of the Journalism School. Her work focuses on communication and the natural world. Please join me in welcoming Lucy Cooke.
Thank you for having me. Oh, is my mic, am I on?
Are you on?
Am I on?
You're on.
Can everybody hear me? My voice cuts through concrete. I don't really need this mic, but anyway, very good.
Glad you got it. Thank you for coming.
My pleasure. I brought the weather with me.
You read my mind. We could have lived without that, but here we are.
Yeah.
I really couldn't be more grateful, especially at this moment in time. Just before we were getting ready to be mic'd and to turn them on, you mentioned France de Waal. And so to have this conversation with you at this moment in time is both poignant, but I think even more important than it was when we started to talk about you potentially coming here. What feels like 400 years ago to talk about your work. So thank you.
My pleasure. Well, it's an honor to be here, genuinely. So, and I'm so impressed that there is anyone here, given the chance. Well, there were no trains apparently, no trains from New Jersey. Friend, that you've walked for a mile to be here. I mean, I thank you all for coming, and I hope you think it's been worth it.
Well, we'll find out.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So I'd like to, we have a very eclectic mix of people here, as Marguerite had mentioned. We've got the folks from the sustainability management, sustainability science communities. We have some journalists. We've got writers of many different shapes, sizes, flavors, and styles. We've got ladies, gentlemen, and bitches. But some people may not be familiar with you, your work. And so I'd like to just kick off the conversation to have an opportunity to find out what kicked you off on storytelling and what I understand it was sloths.
Yeah.
What was it about sloths and why and how you got to here?
Yeah. So yeah, sloths are probably at the start of the journey. So yeah, I mean, I've always told stories. I've always been two things: obsessed with animals and love telling stories. So that's just been since I was small. That's the case, and I particularly like telling stories that make people look at the world in a different way, and also make people laugh. So I'm always on the hunt. Those are the stories that I like to tell the most. And so yeah, many years ago, I was actually trying to save amphibians. That's what I was trying to do, because I was really concerned about the global amphibian crisis, because there's frogs and going extinct at a rate of knots, and I wanted to make a documentary about that, but no one would commission it because I was told that nobody's interested in animals that don't have furry faces at the time. So I was really annoyed about that. So I went off and I went to go and write a blog about my adventures to find out why the world's amphibians were going extinct. And I called myself the Amphibian Avenger. Because I was avenging the right for amphibians to have their stories told, I wrote this blog, and I wrote the blog, and the blog became very, it was actually National Geographic ended up reading the blog and giving me a TV series off the back of it, so it did do well. But the thing that blew it out of the water was I posted a video of some sloths on it. Because I went to go and visit a sloth sanctuary. Because basically, before I headed off, the only non-frog thing that I covered while I was on my travels, I spent 6 months traveling around Latin America by myself, investigating amphibians, which was, a lot of fun. But at the end, I'd been sent this video on a YouTube video, and this was like 15 years ago. No one knew what sloths were at this stage. They were just sleepy animals in trees that no one had really heard of. And I was like, it was a baby sloth. I was like, that is the freakiest looking thing I've ever seen. It's like super cute, but it's got hooks for hands, and it's just, and also it's got a philosophy. It's an animal that's branded with a philosophy. Like, how fantastic is that? And then I Googled it, and I found that there was a place in Costa Rica that only rescued sloths. That was all they did. And I just thought, well, that has got to be a story. Who does that? What kind of a person?
Niche.
Yeah. So they've got to have a story, very niche. They've got to have a story to tell. So I ended up going there, and I made a video and posted it, and it just went nuts. It went insanely viral, and slightly eclipsed the frogs, if I'm honest. And then for a while, I tried. My whole thing was I was trying to pimp the sloths to save the frogs. That's for a while. I tried to sort of shoehorn, but then I thought, oh, people are just interested in sloths, just go with it, Lucy. So that's how. But they are. And as it is that they, their story is really interesting. It's sustainability. It's appropriate that we're here, to talk about sustainability, because they are sustainable.
And God,
the God spoke.
Agrees with you.
The sloths are, exactly. Yeah, they agreed. They are sustainability icons. Everybody thinks. So they are to me, they're like the perfect story, because, everybody thinks, I can't tell you how many times I've been asked, how can sloths exist when they're so slow, they're such losers, Well, it's just, but that's because we, as humans, we're obsessed with going faster than nature intended, and it's killing the planet. Our obsession with convenience and speed is destroying the planet, And so maybe, rather than idolising the cheetah, maybe we should idolise an animal that's been around for tens of millions of years because it's really good at saving energy. Maybe we should think about that instead. Maybe that's a story that's worth telling. So even though at first I found people's fascination with sloths slightly irritating, because I was trying to tell a story about frogs at the time, in the end I've managed to find a good story in there that's worth telling, basically.
Well, thank you for doing that. I want to pick up on something that you just said about being funny. And I say this I ask this with tremendous respect, and somebody who appreciates satire, but also appreciates and loves and is very passionate about science writing and science journalism. You're able to marry both, which is an alchemy that is remarkable and is unique. But how do you do it? Or rather, how do you get away with it without undermining the scientific integrity? And certainly, I don't think anybody who's read any of your books would say that you are not doing anything other than celebrating and drawing attention to the scientific the work of the scientists and their discoveries. So what is the alchemy to being able to combine? Can you define the alchemy, or even speak to the science and the satire while not compromising either?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'd love to try and dress it up as something really clever and intentional, but basically I just really like telling jokes. I just like making people laugh. And I also think it's quite a cunning tool to draw in a big audience, basically. So the stories that I want to tell, I want to tell them, I want them to be read by as many people as possible, or watched by as many people as possible. I want them to be popular, you know, and I'm particularly interested in telling stories that try and change people's minds about things, or you know, or tell a difficult story that you might otherwise not get people interested in, you know, sustainability, for example. Right. You know, but if you tell it with a sloth and you make them laugh, then suddenly you've got them, you know. So in a way, for me, it's like the sort of sugar coating that covers the bitter pill of maybe a difficult message, or some science, you know. I mean, you know, sci-com is now a really kind of fashionable thing, but it hasn't always been. Right. You know, sort of science storytelling is been a bit of a turn-off for a lot of people, and so I kind of want people to read my books who wouldn't normally pick up a science book, you know.
Well, I think that if somebody hasn't picked up a science book, I thoroughly recommend to start with this one. Your chapter about beavers and their gonads was frankly something that I never realized I could enjoy quite so much. So maybe perhaps you could share with the audience here just why beavers are perhaps illustrative of how much bollocks there is out there with regards to science and animals, and sort of the myths that you were debunking, and why it's important to debunk these myths. Yeah,
so that book's all about our how humans just anthropomorphize animals, and how we basically sort of impose our culture and our ideas on animals, and then use that to reflect back on ourselves. And you know, this dates all the way back to the bestiaries, which were like the first animal encyclopedias that were written by the church, and so you know, they're all sort of moral tales. And what's kind of fascinating is we're still using animals to tell moral tales. I mean, many of these myths, you know, these mythological ideas do date back to the bestiary, or even Pliny and the Romans, and they're still in circulation. The beaver, not so much so, because the myth about the beaver was that it gnawed off its own testicles and threw them at the hunter.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I loved that. The image alone, just like, oh, poor guy's been running for miles, throw him a gonad.
So that's all that was ever written about beavers, was that they gnawed off their own testicles and they threw them at the hunter. And actually the reason, you know, and that was all anybody needed to know, apparently. But the reason why that was what was written was that beavers were hunted to extinction in Europe for not their testicles, but their anal glands, actually. I mean, which when removed look exactly like a wizened pair of testicles. And the reason why that they were hunted for this, I mean, it's just an amazing story, I think, is because they contain a liquid called castoreum. And this castoreum was back in the Middle Ages, if you went to the doctor, they would treat you with smells. So there were 40 different animals' feces that you may well be sent home with to sniff casually in order to cure, I don't know, a bad toe or something like that. You know, you go off with a mouse poo and you have to sniff on that. I mean, it's a kind of, you know, it's come a long way, pharmaceuticals, you know. You know, and they sell a lot more now that they don't try and send you home with animal feces. But, you know, anyway, that's a whole other argument. But anyway, so this castoreum was used to treat hysteria in women, because, you know, and hysteria was like this catch-all, basically was just the issue of being a woman, as far as I can tell. I mean, it was like this sort of nebulous illness that was, you know, very, you know, it might be sort of being over-emotional or whatever, but it was, you know, it was, and the way that females were treated for hysteria was by being given castoreum, because the castoreum, like many kind of folk medicines, you're treated with the thing that you are perceived to need, that the thing looks like it, and because it looked like a pair of testicles, of course that's what every woman needs. In order to stop being hysterical is just to sort of, you know, have a pair of testicles. So that's why this sort of myth around, because the myth was that the beavers were sort of removing this thing that was desired by the hunter in order to, and they were hunted to extinction in Europe completely. They were wiped out. People think it was for their fur to make hats and clothes, but it wasn't. It was our
female hysteria.
Yeah, it was because there were so many hysterical women about needing to be cured that beavers went extinct. Yeah, and then when the New World was discovered, there was a whole new beavers here, so they were able to hunt those to extinction as well. So.
I want to ask you about other myths that you slayed, but I also want to pick up on something that you said, that cheetahs aren't that interesting. Having watched the Instagram video of you making one purr, I have to say that was pretty effing amazing myself.
Yeah, they do. They can't roar, but they can purr.
Is that? Yeah. That's how they scare people off. What other myths why was it important as well? Not just simply going back to sort of the bestiaries and debunking those myths, but why is it important to debunk those myths? Why do these animals, why do their stories need to be told, or why do you feel that their stories need to be told?
Well, I think in a lot of ways what that book is, it tells us what we think. It's not so much about what the animals, it's more about what it says about us, you know, that what we're trying to justify about ourselves and imposing that on other animals. So that's what I think is interesting, is, you know, so that's where that sort of, yeah. So I mean, you know, we like animals that are cute and look like babies, but we don't, you know. So for example, we don't like vultures. You know, right. The vultures always think vultures are unclean, but actually they're doing the complete opposite. They are, you know, they're forensic cleanup units. Right. You know, if you don't, you know, there was a recent catastrophic crash in vulture numbers in Africa, in India. They crashed by 90%, and the government had to spend tens of billions because of the increase in disease, because the vultures weren't there to clean. Yeah. And actually, it split the Parsi church as well, because they could no longer do sky burials, and so, you know, anyway, it just so so it's fascinating to me that, you know, we have this idea, oh, scavengers are dirty and unclean, and, you know, but actually the truth is that they're doing the complete opposite. So I find those stories just interesting about how we're still sort of using animals to moralize, you know, and the animal kingdom is the worst place to go for moral guidance. I mean, penguins, for example, March of the Penguins, that film drove me absolutely mad. Because, you know, this is sort of like, oh, penguins are like these sort of, you know, amazing parents, and this sort of, you know, love story between these penguins. Penguins are pathologically unpleasant necrophiliacs. That's what they are. You know, but they don't tell you that in March of the Penguins, you know. So, you know, you don't go to a penguin for moral guidance. Right. It's a bad idea. You know, go to moral guidance, look inside yourself. You know, don't look at a penguin. So, and I love the fact that I wouldn't look at a penguin in that way now. Good. But I am nothing away from today. Make sure you take that away. I'm going to marvel at them for different reasons. Yeah. But with that said, when thinking about, number one, the idea of shifting perception of an animal, a vulture not being a pest, but rather being a public health partner. Mm-hmm. All throughout COVID, one of the things I kept thinking about was vulture poo and its antibacterial properties. Yeah, you can use it as a disinfectant. The woman who ran a vulture sanctuary in South Africa that I visited assured me, because basically they have the reason why they can eat carcasses that are covered in disease, and why we find them revolting, because that is revolting to us, because we would die if we did that. But that's because we don't have stomach acid that's as strong as battery acid, right. Car battery acid, which vultures do. So they're hoovering up pestilence and pooping out purity, basically. And the woman who runs the sanctuary said, yeah, you could use their poo to wash your dishes with if you wanted to. I decided to take her word for it. I didn't try that myself, but yeah, I wouldn't be surprised, you know. But from the point of view, so thinking about, I'm very interested, selfishly, in how we can take that story of the vulture and make them
a charismatic animal that we would want to have a little stuffed version of. By the same token, talking about animals as mirrors and the symbolism that we ascribe that is so misguided, whether it is sort of how we I identify with a penguin. Well,
not anymore.
Not anymore.
Yeah.
Or maybe I do now. We can talk about that with the book signing after a couple of drinks. But the way that we mirror, or the values that we will superimpose. Were there other? You mentioned the vulture. There are obviously the beavers and their glands. What was the other? Was there a particular myth that stood out to you, or a particular animal whose characteristics, obviously necrophiliac penguins, but another one that you felt outraged as you were doing the research was like, oh my God, the symbolism here, the way that society, or the way that we have elevated this particular creature, or understood, or misinterpreted it.
I mean, I suppose the sloth is for me is the kind of is the kind of main, because that that really is just sort of what's wrong with being slow? There's nothing wrong with it. There really isn't anything wrong with being slow and energy saving, and that's aspirational really. So that was one of the probably the impetus for writing, and then I found all the others that kind of fitted around that.
Is that how? What led you to Bitch? Was it the research here? How did you go from slaying myths from Descartes? The chapter on bats is particularly disturbing.
Yeah.
To then bringing us to today and Bitch. What was it that you felt so compelled to address?
Well, I just realised that an entire gender had been misrepresented. It wasn't just like individual species. So it was the same, and I just, gave me an opportunity to tell a similar kind of, that kind of story that I like, which is you think this thing, but actually I'm going to tell you it's completely opposite from what you think, which is a very satisfying story to tell. And there's lots of room for humour along the way, because I've got people to poke fun at who've started these rumours, and respected and notable figures like Charles Darwin, no less. So it's quite it just.
How's that been received?
Yeah, well, it's really interesting. I was asked pretty much straight away. I was asked to speak at Cambridge, to be part of the Darwin Festival. So it's really interesting. Some places have been very progressive and recognise that there needs to be a dialogue around, around Darwin's legacy, and Cambridge are really laudably, upfront and on that. Whereas other institutions less so. So it's just a sort of slow-moving thing that some places have received it, and it's on the syllabus. Despite the title, it's on the syllabus of lots of universities, evolutionary biology courses. But yeah, so it shouldn't be a surprise. I think what's fantastic is that this generation, we now understand there's this thing called cultural bias. It makes us view the world in a certain way. We view the world through the prism of our own existence. That's what we do. That's why we need diversity, because that means we get asked lots of questions from lots of different perspectives, and there are still some people who are resistant to that, and see maybe that's something that other people suffer from, but they don't.
But not me.
Yeah.
But not me. Well, it's one of the things, I think I've mentioned this to you, I've certainly mentioned it to folks here. There's very little that I've asked for folks to bring me back from the UK when they go. The weather certainly isn't one of them.
No.
But your book was.
Aww.
And one of the things that I'd like to know why the Brits went for the praying mantis and the Americans went for the hyena.
Well, that's just publisher's choice.
But what are the stories of each of these animals? Why is there the publishers?
Well, the praying mantis obviously is a sexual cannibal, who, famously will consume their lover before, during, and or after sex. So And actually, when I was writing the book, that was the question that everybody would say to me. It's like, oh, you're going to be writing about the praying mantis then. So I almost didn't, because it just sort of annoyed me that I just thought, oh, it's just really obvious. There is a chapter, 50 Ways to Eat Your Lover.
But they're not the only one.
Yeah, no, but it's not. There's only a brief mention of the praying mantis in there as a sexual cannibal, because actually spiders, it turns out, are much more interesting to explore as sexual cannibals. But there's no way they put a spider on the front, because it's way too unpopular, and they'd be worried nobody would buy it.
I have to say that I am an extreme arachnophobe. Anybody who's been in the presence of a spider with me and knows that I can leap literally furniture.
You're like a cat that's just seen a cucumber.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
That's me.
Yeah.
So I say it from the point of view of I actually love spiders now, and I have actually started going, not all spiders, let me be clear, but an appreciation at the end of summer by seeing the webs. The webs now mean something very different to me.
Well, they mean something different, right? Because I didn't even know before I wrote that book, I had no idea that when you see a spider in a web, that spider's very likely going to be a female. Because it's only the females that really make webs. You know, the males basically, you know, are kind of, they lead I mean, they sort of walking sacks of sperm, basically. They often don't have mouths, fangs, they don't have poison, they don't, you know, because it's the females are bigger, you know, sometimes they're like 150 times bigger than the male. I mean, they're gargantuan in comparison, because they're the one they're making all the eggs, right? So they need to be big and well nourished and to make lots of eggs. And the males, all their entire job, they don't eat at all. They don't hunt. They definitely don't, you know, need to build webs. But what they do have to do is try and mate with this enormous predator that eats things that look like them for dinner, you know, and that takes some skill. And so the males have really, I mean, I found it incredibly endearing, actually, because it's the only chapter in the book it's kind of, you know, it's told from the male perspective, because I mean, you know, seduction is it's a dangerous game. You know, people are vulnerable in that moment, but no more vulnerable than a male spider, because you know,
them. And they try so hard.
They try so hard. So basically, they've got to get her attention. So the thing is, it's really difficult. So you know, one of the questions I always get asked is why are males more flamboyant or whatever? It's just they're just trying to get noticed, right? It's just a lot of effort just to get noticed. So you know, if you're a spider, it's no different. You've got to get noticed by the female, and the way to do that is to make like food. You know, she's gonna pay attention to that. You know, so you get on the web and you've got to sort of shake it like you're a little bit like a fly, but then you've got to let her know that you're not a fly. You know, and so you know, it's really, so they do. You know, they'll do things like they'll bring a dead fly wrapped in silk. You know, here you go. Please have that, and then nip round the back and try and, you know, get busy with the pedipalps. Or they'll wait until she's eating anyway to make their approach. You know, so there's like a whole way, all these sort of very charming ways that the males have evolved to try and sort of, you know, get over this enormous hurdle of trying to copulate with a female that will probably eat them in the end, actually. and so then there was this fantastic thing that Darwin wrote about. So in The Descent of Man, which was his follow-up to On the Origin of Species, and it was sort of like his difficult second album. You know, On the Origin of Species had laid out his theory of evolution by natural selection, huge success, huge controversy, but he was still bothered by things like the peacock's tail, which were these sort of flamboyant armaments and ornaments in nature that couldn't be explained by the kind of utilitarian force of natural selection. So he came up with a sexual selection, and he wrote this book, The Descent of Man, which is where he lays out all these different differences between males and females, and in that there's all these fantastic notes of correspondences he's got with other gentlemen naturalists who's sending him information from the front line, and the horror that he receives in a letter from one gentleman correspondent about, and I've seen the female spider eat the male and she's bigger, and they're just absolutely they're just horrified by this thing, and like, how could that be? You know, how could the dominant male be, you know, consumed by the female? You know, like, how could this be? And so it was considered this conundrum of why this would happen. Well, you know, it makes total sense, because the male it's an ultimate act of fatherhood, that you're nourishing the eggs that you've fertilized, you know, so it's just good parenting, spider style, you know.
So I'll get all emotional. As you were doing, one of the things that jumps off the page, especially in Butch, now that I've combined book and bitch. Butch.
The next one, the follow-up.
Exactly,
yeah.
Butch.
Yeah.
One of the is your delight while you're following the field scientists. What else delighted you while you were following them? Was it the use of the mechanical birds?
Yeah.
In terms of the ingenuity of what you saw in the research process, of the lengths that folks would go to, whether it be the animal or whether it be the scientist to get the discovery. Is there something that stands out?
I mean, I just love field scientists. I studied zoology at university, but I was never going to be a scientist. I mean, I just don't have the patience. And I arrive at field stations. I love field stations so much, because they're like the front line of science. And, you know, everybody's dressed the same, in the same green, moldy clothing. Everybody stinks of mold. You're all sleep deprived. You've all been up since 2 a.m., you know, following around. And most scientists in the field, their job is to collect animal waste of some form or another. That's basically the secret to animal behaviors. You're either watching them or you're running around with, I mean, I was in Costa Rica just the other day, following these people studying capuchins with this woman whose job was to carry the urine racket. And her job was to try and catch the urine of the monkeys. You know, she's like running. I mean, it was hard enough to keep up with the monkeys. You know what I mean? Like they're like making a mockery of us in their treetop superhighway, and she's like running around with a urine racket. I mean, I just think it's just kind of amazing that we know anything about the animal kingdom when you get to see actually how science is practiced. And it's just this sort of, you know, you can't go to a shop and buy a urine racket. Right. You've got to make a urine racket.
No, you have to make it.
You know, so, and I just really love that people do that. I mean, I remember spending time...
How do you make it?
Oh, you get a fishing net and then you put a plastic bag over it. Okay. It's not that difficult. But I mean, you know, to try and make...
Sorry. I'm sorry,
but just, you know, but that one's not that difficult. But some of the other things are really creative, you know. So I love that. I love that kind of Heath Robinson aspect of it, that they've, you know, somebody, not only have they got this question that they need to solve, they've got to try and work out how they collect the data, you know, which is normally in fecal form. So so I just really love field scientists and just kind of delight in those places. And the first day I'm always there, I always think, oh God, I'd love to have been a field scientist. And then after a day, I'm like, I'm thank God I'm not a field scientist. Like, there's just no way. These people do it every single day. They go out every single day and they do it again and again and again and again. And it's exhausting because it always involves just insane early mornings and running around chasing things.
So not only is it exhausting to undertake the research, but then you have to make sure that you get the research out there and reviewed. So from one of the things about that, among many that stand out, is it's as much about the findings as it is about the experience of these scientists. Is there something that stands out from the point of view of a finding that had particular resistance to being accepted because of Darwin or because of the other great minds?
I mean, there's loads of it. I mean, that's the thing. Is basically what I'm looking at is how, you know, Darwin was a brilliant scientist, but he was a Victorian man, and so when he came in the Descent of Man to describing females, they came out in the shape of a Victorian housewife, passive, coy, and submissive. And because Darwin said that, it meant that for over 150 years, all the scientists that followed in his wake suffered from a chronic case of confirmation bias, and only saw what Darwin had laid out. So, and it was it was basically a bunch of American feminists who changed the record, and Sarah Blaffer-Hrdy, I don't know if anybody here has heard of her, she's amazing primatologist. She was the front runner, and Patricia Goarty, and they encountered a huge amount of resistance. I mean, Sarah was the first to show that, or to study why female langurs, with these sort of very elegant monkeys in India, why she'd gone to investigate infanticide. There'd been she was at Harvard, and she went out to the field. She heard that there was a story that maybe the males were killing babies. It all seemed very unlikely, but anyway, she got something. Yes, males are killing babies, but also she noticed that the females were mating with males. Any male, outside of the group just didn't make any sense. And she was the first person who didn't ignore that, and instead she thought, well, that's really interesting. I wonder if that's connected. And she discovered that absolutely it is, and that the females are being sexually strategic because the males are infanticidal. And the reason why they're infanticidal is females who are nursing don't want to mate, because so if a male comes in and into a new territory, the females are not going to want to mate with that male if they're already nursing. So, but if he kills the babies, then that will force them into their fertility period, and so they're available for mating. So that's the strategy. It's brutal, but it works. But the female counter strategy is to mate with multiple males, and so if a male has mated with a female recently, then they're less likely to kill the babies because they might be theirs, right? So she was the first person to propose this, and she told me when she came up with the theory, she'd have professors say to her, "Oh, come on, Sarah, you're just horny." She actually had, and just nobody took it seriously. And now we know that over 60 mammals, it's been accepted. And Patricia Goarty, who's an incredible scientist, and when she discovered that she was the first person to do DNA fingerprinting on a clutch of eggs, everybody thinks songbirds are monogamous, and it was always assumed that they were monogamous. But she was like, I wonder. And so she's the first person. She took forensic technology, and she did DNA, paternity tests on a clutch of eggs, and showed that clutch of eggs frequently has multiple fathers. It made perfect sense to her. Why put all your eggs in one basket?
But
if you mate with multiple males, you're more likely to hit the genetic jackpot and find a good, genetic mix. But when she presented her data at a conference, she was told that the only way that was possible was if the females had been raped. Which is actually, as she points out, completely impossible if you're a songbird, because male songbirds don't have penises, they don't have arms. They can't. In order to mate, the male has to balance on the female's back precariously and line up cloacas, and if the female's not interested, she can fly off at any point. So but that was the only way that information was accepted for 10 years until. A number of other ornithologists put trackers on the backs of female birds and tracked their motions, and saw that the females were flying into other territories and actually soliciting sex outside of their partnership. And eventually it was accepted that females had sexual agency. But I mean, these myths are really stuck, and even still today, there's a double standard. I mean, in all these cases, all these females in the animal kingdom that are mating with multiple males, they're not just doing it for being frivolous. They're doing it to be good mothers. It's all about being a good mother, So and that was really interesting to me. Just this idea that you can't be, we just have the double standard, and it's just there's just a whole bunch of bad names for that kind of behaviour, but it's about being a good mother in the animal kingdom.
Well, I think that, as you're saying that, with the birds that come to mind with such markedly different personalities and attributes than obviously that you grow up with, the myths that you grow up with, from the albatross to the necrophiliac penguins, but also throughout primates, the way that chimpanzees behave in their societies versus the bonobos. I never feel like I'm pronouncing that properly.
Bonobos.
Thank you. I never get it right. I'm always thinking of the socks. So is that, the stark difference, the contrast between styles and the way and that they do manifest being a good mother. By the same token, the other thing that comes to mind that I found incredibly poignant was your chapter about sort of menopause and matriarchs as well. The misunderstanding or the myths around killer whales versus the knowledge of a post-menopausal whale. Granny, I think, was the one that you mention in the book, and having seen her, and similarly with elephants and the absolute upheaval that their families experience at the loss of these matriarchs. And the way to be able to look at sort of older women and as having utility, of having value, of having wisdom. I hope that as a woman who's now reaching that period, that it can indeed become a mirror. But were there other situations as well that you saw where it was such a complete, not a misconception from the point of view of the myth, but what you were seeing in the behaviors of the animals themselves that were far more akin to what you knew to be true of us? We're sluts, we're promiscuous, we're also strategic, we're conniving, and whether it's on the female side but also on the male side, I found it really compelling that the males of various species were responding and had been shaped by actually generations of female behavior. That was amazing to me. I'm sure not to many. But what were the contrasts that stuck out to you when you were doing it?
Well, I think that the killer whales are is just a great story. I mean, I'm a woman of a certain age. I was very drawn to the idea that the leaders of Orca society weren't the males, as everybody had assumed. I actually had a man at a party mansplain after writing this book. And he'd heard me on BBC Radio 4 presenting my series about this book. Nevertheless, at a party, he said, "No, but of course, I mean, when males are bigger than females, they're going to dominate. I mean, have you done any? Are you interested in data?" And I said, "No, I just make it all up. Actually, not interested in data at all." But he said you should do some graphs. Have you done any graphs? Like, no, I haven't got any graphs in the book. You're right, there aren't any graphs. But anyway, so there's this sort of lazy assumption that dominance and size are inextricably linked, and that males who are bigger than females will naturally dominate, and orcas fall into that category. And because the males are bigger than the females, and so everybody assumed that the males were the leaders of orca society. Turns out it's not the males, it's the females. And not only that, it's the postmenopausal grannies. And I just was like, well, this is just a brilliant story, because females just have, from Darwin's time and beyond, it's just nurturing and motherhood. That's it. That's our only function as females. There's like nothing else. We're just pumping out babies, and we're all. And the idea amongst it was that we're just all the same at it as well. That there's no variation. I mean, it's hilarious to think that this is actually what was thought, and it's still considered by many people that females don't vary as much as males, but that there's no variation in that. So anyway, I just thought this is a brilliant story, because it shows the orcas show that the fact that these postmenopausal females are the leaders of the society shows that females do have a function beyond just having babies, and what's more brilliant about it is just because menopause is incredibly rare in the animal kingdom, and for a long time it was thought that we didn't know of any other species that naturally went through menopause. The only cases we knew of females living beyond their reproductive fitness that were outside of our own species were in zoos. So they were gorillas or chimpanzees. There was the odd great ape that did. As you say, elephants continue, believe it or not, to go through their 22-month pregnancy well into their 60s, which they deserve some kind of a prize for. But they don't go through menopause. It's interesting, but they don't. So there's this anomaly that these orca females are doing this, and thank goodness that we now know that they do, because before, one of the theories is why human females went through menopause. It was just, we were sort of these menopausal freaks, and there was no explanation for it, and it was assumed that we were a bit like the gorilla in the zoo that's propped up by medicine and regular meals, and we should be dying out, in my case literally round about this second now,
just wait
alongside
till
our
after the book
ovaries.
signing.
Exactly, yeah.
It's been enough today.
Yeah.
Just wait till after the book signing.
But then we find out that orcas actually go through menopause as well, and so then and the reason why they don't is so that they don't compete with their daughters over resources, and instead of that, because that's another thing that's not considered to be feminine is competition, aggressive competition. Well, tell that to a meerkat. Females are incredibly aggressive and competitive in many species. But rather than being aggressively competitive, the orcas are actually not competing with their daughters, so they stop reproducing halfway through. And also they've evolved to live for a very long time, much as we have in our species. Unusually long. So Granny, who was the leader of the southern residents, she was around 100. It was hard to tell when she was captured, and that is very long. So elephants sort of live into their 60s, and there aren't many species that alongside us also live a really long time. So these wise old lady whales, these orcas, become the repositories for ecological wisdom that keep their hunting clan alive. They live longer than the males, and they have this life, this leadership life after being mothers, of leading their community, because orcas have very particular culture. And so they specialise in hunting different things. So the southern residents specialise in hunting salmon, but that's really hard. Well, it's increasingly hard now. There's hardly any salmon left. But you've got to work out where the salmon's going to be. But some specialise in ripping the livers out of great white sharks. That's what they do, and so that culture passes down. So they are these sort of these. It was just a really great story because it's just. Offers hope, doesn't it? For the postmenopausal female,
There's life ahead.
Yes, exactly. Well, maybe we evolved for the same thing. Maybe our wisdom is of value to society. That's what I believe.
We'll
be more orca. That's what T-shirt. Yeah.
I'm very sensitive to the fact that I don't want to hog you, and I'm sure that we have questions from the audience. So I would like to open it up. There is a hand up right at the back. If I could please ask one of our friends to.
For those of us who want to influence and change behavior, do you have some storytelling? Oh, thank you. This is much easier. For those of us here who do want to influence or change behavior with our stories or break these myths, do you have some storytelling levers that you pull? Do you have some direction for us?
I think the thing is you've got to. I always, I'm as ideological as anybody, and I like certain stories that tell certain things because I think that's, I want to sort of. But I think you've just got to be covert about it. You can't. I think for me the secret is not to sort of. I try not to lecture people. I try to sort of smuggle in messages and smuggle in things so that people don't feel like they're being lectured to and that's why I think humor is really helpful in that way, that you can sort of look at that funny stab that's really my approach.
Next question. Do you like a saber or a foil when you're going?
It's something short.
Very British. Yeah. Did you receive any pushback from the scientific community from this? Have you found that the book? Sorry, I'm.
Not as much as I thought. I was really anticipating a lot more than there has been. I mean, I was really careful to make sure that I was right.
Okay.
So I just thought, but I just that's. You don't. I mean, writing a book these days, no one actually. There's the idea, this mythical fact-checking thing that happens. Like in publishing, it doesn't happen. Like, there's no one checking facts. It's up to you, the author. You are responsible for your information. No, I mean, people don't realise that. But so you can just write bullshit, you know. I mean, like, and no one's going to check it, you know. But I mean, because I'm trying to sort of show that bias exists, you know, I have to make sure that, and I'm aware that I'm also attracted to certain types of stories. So, and I, you know, you don't know whether that's, you know, whether it's right or not. So I was very careful to have lots of readers that I paid to read the book from different perspectives,
Really?
and different agendas, you know, to read it with a different lens to make sure that it was right. So, you know, I haven't had that much pushback.
What about from the patriarchy? You got mansplained.
Yeah, I mean, I get mansplained, of course I do. You know, I mean, I'm a woman.
Yeah,
So,
I was about
you know,
to-
but I mean, yeah, no. I mean, I had, yeah, not really, and not as much as I thought.
Okay. Yes. You have a question. Where will you get to first?
Thank you. Have you ever discovered a story that you thought you were going to tell one way, and then you looked at it deeper, and then it turned out to tell a completely different story?
Oh, I mean, I suppose the sloths would fall into that, because I did just think they were cute to start off with, and then I realised that they were a good metaphor for something deeper. But yeah, so I mean, I would say that falls into that category, but nothing else springs to mind. But you know, I mean, you do, when you're investigating a story, it definitely grows and develops. And often, like, I find when I'm writing something, I don't necessarily know, I don't always know where it's going to end up. You know, I just have a sense about it being good, you know. Yeah.
I think we have there was another question. You sold me with the sustainability angle, and I do think it would be good for us to advocate for the sloth to be a sustainable mascot of that at Columbia. So do we have a question at the back?
Yes, sorry. Thank you so much for this talk. It's been so interesting. I had a question about the writing process itself. Did you ever find, did you ever at any time find that it was a bit of a challenge to keep up the momentum in finding humour and joy in certain stories? And if so, do you have any tips for aspiring writers on how to kind of manage those moments of maybe it's just writer's block, but trying to find the humour in a situation?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. I mean, of course, I'm just like anybody else. Like, you know, I have good days and bad days, and I actually find that they often flip one. You know, I have a good day, and then the next day I have an appalling day. You know, and you know, I mean, I don't know how many people would call themselves writers in this room. Yeah, so I don't know about you, but I mean, if I have a bad day, my whole world collapses. Like, I am rubbish company. If I've had a bad writing day, I am completely destroyed by it. It's a very evil trait of being a writer, because it makes you, you know, if you've been invited to dinner at somebody's house, I mean, you're physically present, but your mind is just, you know, full of trying to work out how to tell things or whatever. But yeah, so I mean, I have good days and bad days, and I think the thing that I've learnt is if I'm really struggling, just walk away from it and go for a walk. Actually, that is the best thing, is just to go away, go for a walk, go and meet a friend, and if you can bring yourself, try and tell them the story that you're struggling with. That is often the thing that will really help me, is if I can try and engage a friend and tell them a story, and then suddenly and then I'll think, oh, why didn't I record that? You know, because then I've done it, I've got it up, and then I'll go and scribble it down, and that really helps for me, telling stories out loud, actually. Yeah, I mean, it's an evil thing, writer's block, you know, very real indeed.
Very real. You have, yes. Oh, hello.
Hi. Thank you for this. This is really, really something I didn't realize I needed today, necrophiliac penguins especially. Are there, as you were talking about all of these fantastical creatures, do you have plans, or would you consider writing a children's book? And what would that look like? Can you translate necrophiliac penguins to children?
Good.
Why wouldn't you?
Yeah, I know, exactly. Yeah, I know, it's what every child needs. you know, I have actually done, my first book was a children's book, weirdly, yeah. And while I was writing it, people kept saying to me, "Oh, what age group is it for?" And I was like, "Well, I don't know." I just didn't. And then when I read it back, and I think to myself, "Oh God," like I'm so embarrassed by the language and everything. But it won lots of readers' awards. It's really interesting. It's just like but I'm not very good. I don't have kids of my own, so I haven't done that bedtime storytelling. You know, like So I suppose maybe in some ways the fact that I haven't done any of that meant that I came to it fresh and did something slightly different. And it's been still in print. It was a New York Times bestseller, that, you know, it was my first book. It took me a week to write. And my other friends who are writers were really pissed. I'd been a filmmaker for many years, and then I'd turned to writing, and I'd written this book, and it'd taken me a week, and I was a New York Times bestseller, and they were just really irritated. Which now I've written a proper length book, I fully understand why. But so I think in some ways it was an advantage that I didn't really know. But I have thought about doing the subject matter of Bitch as a kid's book, obviously with a different title.
Dream killer.
Butch, perhaps. I don't know. There you go. You're giving it to me tonight. Thank you.
Take it.
But I just haven't had time. But I'd like to, you know. I share the same puerile sense of humour with children, so, you know, I feel like there's some commonality there.
We've got one last question. I'm going to be selfish and take it. What was the biggest surprise? The biggest surprise as you were doing this?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest surprise to me when I was researching Bitches, I really was interested in. I went in search of sexist bias, which I found in spades. But what I wasn't expecting was heteronormative bias, which I myself suffered. So I actually had to sort of address my own bias while I was writing, and obviously we're at a time where we are really interrogating sex and gender and what that means at the moment, both in culture and amongst the scientific community. And so that was actually a really interesting story to tell. And the one animal that I came across that really blew my mind, because it was an animal I was incredibly familiar with and I had no idea it had such an interesting story, was the common garden mole. So, you know, I mean, you have moles here, and they probably ruin lawns just as much here as they did. You know, my dad used to be obsessed with trapping moles using sort of barbaric metal traps because they were ruining the lawn. Anyway, turns out being a mole is a difficult job. You know, you've got to hunt worms in the dark, and evolution has gifted the mole a bunch of great adaptations to make that easier. So the moles have got like an extra thumb, so they can dig hard, and they can smell in stereo, so they can find worms in the dark. But the most amazing thing about the female mole are her gonads, because she has what's described as ovotestes. So her gonads are internal. And they are part ovarian tissue, which makes eggs during the breeding season, but they're also large amounts of testicular tissue, which outside of the breeding tissue, there's more testicular tissue than there is ovarian tissue. So it dwarfs it, and that pumps out loads of testosterone, makes her dig really hard, makes her really aggressive, defending her worm larder. And so that's really interesting. I was like, wow, I didn't know that about moles, that they have these kind of like basically flexible gonads that can kind of, the tissue can adapt from, you know.
Is that why are they bald? They're not bald.
No, they're not bald. No, that's naked mole rats you're thinking
of.
Got it. But yeah, so the mole, you know, and so there was a global consortium of scientists, of geneticists that decoded the mole's genome to find out why they, you know, were able to do this, why female moles had this. And it turns out that there's just a mutation of, it's just two genes, they're not even genes that code for regulatory proteins, basically. And that gives the mole this sort of gonadal flexibility of their tissues. But what it actually, the reason why it's just so amazing and really blew my mind is, and I'm just going to give you a little lesson in sex determination, because I was really kind of amazed by this, because I was taught genetics at university, and I was, you know, XY is a male and XX is a female, and you sort of assume that all the genes for being male are on the Y and the genes for being female are on the X. And so to find out about the mole, I ended up speaking to Jenny Graves, who's decoded the sex chromosomes of everything from platypus to nematode worms, and she was part of the group that found the SRY gene and the human trigger. And what she told me was that, she said, we used to think that the pathways to male and female in the fetus were linear and distinct, but they're anything but, and that they're enmeshed and they're antagonistic. And so in order to, the fetus starts off as neutral, but it's actually female, but that's another story. But anyway, it starts off as neutral, let's just say. And then there's a trigger for it to become either male or female. And then that triggers the making of a testes or making an ovary, basically. So you have these two pathways that to make a testes, you have to suppress an ovary. But the genes that either make a testes or make an ovary, they're the same 60 genes. Whoa. And they're not on the X or Y, they're scattered throughout the genome. They're all, and I think that when you understand that, and when you understand that males, as I write, males evolved out of females because females were the original sex, because asexual reproduction is about cloning, about making eggs, and males evolved out of females. When you understand all of that, it's really important, because I think, thanks to Darwin, he drove a wedge between the sexes by focusing on differences, and we're culturally obsessed with the differences between sexes, when actually we should be thinking about the similarities. We're mostly the same. We're made of the same freaking genes, the same hormones, the same brains. There's no such thing as pink and blue brains. It's bullshit. So we should just, and then I just feel like that's a really important lesson to learn, and that it was the mole that gave that to me and really kind of made me, really look at the world differently. I think understanding that there is just so much similarity rather than difference, and the differences are so small.
Thank you. That is a beautiful way to end. Lucy Cooke, thank you very much.